Hello and welcome to the Azure A to Z virtual conference put on by Opgility Skill Me Up Academy. My name is Brian Gorman and I am going to be your presenter today for the Azure Web Apps session. Now this is pre-recorded as an FYI. Now I'm an Azure MVP, a technical trainer. You can reach me at BL Gorman on Twitter, Brian L. Gorman on LinkedIn, or Brian at Major Guidance Solutions. I am a Microsoft Azure MVP. I have a number of Microsoft Azure certifications as well as some original developer certifications. I have also been working in the technical trainer space for quite some time now, and I just recently finished my second edition of Practical Entity Framework Course 6. So check that out if you're interested in a book like that. Again, I'm an MVP and it's a great honor, and I'm happy to be here to promote the Azure space as I love it. If you have any questions about any of the certifications that you see here or any certifications at Azure in general, I'd be happy to speak with you. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So today we're going to take a really demo-heavy approach. We'll see a few screenshots, maybe a few things here and there, but we're going to be doing a lot of demos, and they will be heavily edited just to help expedite the timing because of the things that happen at Azure taking some time. So just be aware of that. Again, this is pre-recorded, and you're not going to have to wait for things to happen live. Throughout the talk, we're going to cover the basic features and benefits of the Azure Web App ecosystem. We're going to spend most of our time building out a simple web solution, reviewing some of the benefits and features of that web app along the way. We'll start by covering where we came from. And again, if you've been attending the conference, another talk that I have is the app modernization talk, which is very similar as far as the modernization of applications into the Azure web space. Along with that, we're going to talk about where we came from and then where we're going to go to with this simple web application as an Azure App Service using Azure SQL. We'll integrate CI/CD with GitHub Actions. We'll also be leveraging the app service configuration for some different pieces of information. We'll get a couple of pseudo secrets from that, as well as we will end up putting a secret into Key Vault just to see how easy it is to get this out there and then also get it running so that you can have kind of this demo of everything that you can do in just a few minutes with a powerful web app solution at Azure. So let's start from where we started from back in the day, traditional deployments. Typically, you would see companies having an on-prem data center. So that might be your own building where you've secured down your servers and your actual physical metal hardware, and everybody's adminning all of that and setting up your networks and your firewalls and making sure your web server farm is load balanced correctly, making sure that your data server farm is load balanced correctly. So after having your own on-prem data center, you may have moved to a third-party virtualization provider like Rackspace or Accenture or CloudReach or some other provider that was basically your MSP, managing your services for you. And ultimately, they may have been using another cloud behind the scenes, or they may have had their own physical on-prem data center, but traditionally you were doing the same kind of deployment. Furthermore, you may have actually started to move into Azure or another cloud and done what we'll call a lift and shift architecture move. Ultimately, just recreating the same exact architecture you have on your on-prem or through your third-party virtualization provider at Azure as infrastructure as a service. In those cases, no matter what approach you took in all of those, you were rolling your own solution. And by that I meant you have everything home cooked. That means you have to implement all your monitoring or get third-party tools to do that, wire it all up. The reporting around that's probably home baked as well. Maybe some SQL Server reporting services where you have all these different solutions that you're developing and monitoring and managing and all of this stuff. You had manual deployments, or you had automated deployments, which was somebody wrote an app, you push a button, and it did some stuff out in the magic world of your data center. Hopefully when you push the button, it works, so you do a little push and pray maybe. And yeah, there's nothing worse than that feeling, right? Ultimately, you were also responsible for your licensing and your patching and just other traditional things that you had to manage. So the idea is, okay, that was great for the time, but now we can actually move this into the cloud. And not only can we move it into the cloud, even if we're in the lift and shift moved into the cloud, we can modernize this into an Azure web app. And with that, we're going to talk about today doing that and getting it out there. So the benefits of the app services then at Azure are going to be based around what you see here with the shared responsibility model. So note that when you were on-prem, everything over here on the right, all of these different responsibilities were all yours. Now, as you maybe moved to a lift and shift or provisioned your stuff at someone else's provider, you likely didn't have physical host, physical network, or data center, but you were still responsible for operating system, networks, applications, licensing. All of that was on you. What we're going to do is we're going to move into an app service where we get platform as a service. And in that case, All of that stuff is going to be handled for us by Microsoft. Additionally, we'll also have things like automated backups. We'll have the built-in monitoring ecosystem that comes with Azure, as well as security and role-based access control. And if you're still in some on-prem and cloud hybrid scenario, you can still do this. You can move into the cloud, you can set up your Azure Active Directory and your Windows Active Directory, and you can sync them together to provide a seamless transition for your users to log in once and be able to do a single sign-in into both environments. Additionally, getting out into the web app service area will give you the ability to integrate easily with other Azure services, as we'll see throughout the day today. And you'll get the flexibility and elasticity of the cloud, meaning that you're going to get the ability to scale up or scale down or scale out and in, depending on what your needs are. And you can even make that automatic. So you don't have to worry about someone monitoring your server when you're running the after holiday sale and everybody wants to be home with their family instead of watching a server to make sure it doesn't get overloaded. The final piece of the puzzle with that to keep in mind is that as I build this out into the cloud now, even when I'm scaling in and out, I'm not buying new hardware and then having this massive server that was just in case we had a load that we needed to support, or we ran out of space. Now what do we do? How do we get more space, or how do we get more compute power? With the cloud, you only pay for what you use, and you can spin up and spin down at will, and your costs are proportional to what you use. So you don't pay for something you don't need, and you don't have a situation where you don't have an ability to respond to your need. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is start diving into the demo-heavy portion of this, where we're going to start building out our app service. So ultimately, when we provision at Azure, we have some choices. We can do it through the portal, where we just go in and start clicking and pointing and doing things, and that's what we're going to do today. Ultimately, though, if you want to do an imperative deployment, you can do that through commands, either through the Azure CLI or PowerShell, or some combination of PowerShell and the Azure CLI. If you want to get into automated deployments, you're going to be looking into templates. And the flavor of choice at Azure is the ARM template, which is also now available through Bicep. So you can create Bicep if you're not familiar with ARM templates. It's a little bit easier to get into doing Bicep. It's just a little bit more user-friendly for the programmer than learning and working with the JSON of an ARM template directly. And ultimately, Bicep translates to ARM templates. If you don't like ARM templates, or if you already have other solutions, of course, Terraform, Pulumi, and some other solutions are out there and also very popular. It's just that ARM templates are the basis for everything we do at Azure. So that's what you would ordinarily use if you don't have another solution that you're already relying on. Finally, there's a REST API. And the REST API is very useful to validate configurations or go out and check things once they're out there, or potentially get some settings or see things what are happening. But likely you're not going to use that for provisioning as much. You'll likely only use that if you need to look for things like configuration drift on a resource or something. So here what you see is we're going to go ahead and create our instance in a resource group somewhere in an Azure region. In this case, the East US. We're going to create a web app. We'll have it named whatever we want. It just has to be unique and fully qualified domain name in a resource group that makes sense. Resource groups, again, are just for humans to group things together so that we can keep track of where we're putting things. Now, ultimately, we'll name it something, again, unique. We'll have the framework of .NET 6. In case you wanted to, at this point, you could choose Docker containers. You could containerize it, and you can even point to an Azure Container Registry, which contains your container images as your deployment source. So that's pretty cool, too. If you like containers, you might look into that. All right, so then you choose the SKU, which is the most important thing. You get your web app plan that you're going to create. So likely you'll create a new one, or you'll use one that's out there, but most of the time you'll be creating a new one. And it can be one app plan for multiple app services, but just remember that those multiple app services would be sharing the resources as dictated by the plan. So you would be having a competition over the compute that's allocated to that plan amongst your resources. So you might see that as a production server farm. You might have one app service plan with maybe 3 production app services that you load balance. In development, you might have an app service plan with 10 app services, or you may have one-to-one, especially if you're doing a free app service plan for a development instance or something. Here we'll choose standard because that's the first level where we can actually get a slot, and we want to see slots for our automated deployment later. And it's a bad idea to deploy automated deployments into your production slot, so that's why we're going to do that. If you were only doing a free application here, just playing around, development, testing, whatever, you would not be able to have slots, so you would just deploy to your production slot and get the warning that says, hey, you're deploying to your production slot. Not a big deal. Once you get it out there, with that first page, the next page is the deployment. Now you can enable this right here during the provisioning, where you actually log into your GitHub and you're able to select the organization repository branch, and it will build a CI/CD YAML file and publish that into your workflows for GitHub Actions at GitHub. You can also do other places like Azure DevOps or Bitbucket or GitLab or whatever you need to do, there are a few of those that are built in there automatically. You can always build your own. Now we're going to skip this when we do it the first time because we don't want to deploy to production. So we're going to create a slot later for staging, and then we'll build the deployment on top of that. And that will show us how we can just go to the deployment center and do that at any point. Once we have this deployment, we'll skip that. Basically, we'll say we don't want it. Then we'll go to the app service monitoring. You're always going to want some sort of monitoring. This is Application Insights. This gives you a lot of automatic built-in monitoring on your solution, and you can add code that you can actually do additional things, which we'll see in our application as well. The region should be automatic based on your resource group or the service plan that you're choosing. We'll also be able to have multiple application insights so that we can separate them for our developers and our staging slot versus our production, just to make sure we're not all writing to the same application instance. There's always tags on any resource, so I'm going to cover them here once and I'm not going to talk about them again. They're optional, they're arbitrary key value pairs, and your organization will need to get together and decide how you want to do this, if you're going to use them at all. So you can use this as a billing boundary that transcends resource groups and subscriptions, so you can roll up costs to a specific department. You can also use it as a way to group resources that are for a specific environment, like production or test or dev. You can do all kinds of things, but it's going to be up to you. You can also then choose which resources to tag during deployment. So there are 3 resources here. The second one, I just dropped out one over here to not tag Application Insights, just to show you can do that, not because it means anything or was a reasonable thing to do. All right, so it's time now to dive into our first demo. Just remember, this is pre-recorded and will be heavily edited to help expedite the timing. So to begin, I'm going to go to App Services, and on the App Services, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new one. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put this in our resource group. We're going to call it A to Z Simple Web DN6. We're going to have it code. This is again where I could do Docker container. We're going to do .NET 6. We're going to use the Windows operating system. If we were going to do containerized, we could do Linux. We're going to put it in the East US for this purpose. Put it near you. It doesn't matter where it goes as long as it's near your customers. And then we're going to create a new plan with standard. I just want to highlight, if I wanted to change the size here, I could choose a free plan at the dev level or a higher paid dev test level of plan for a little bit more compute power or a little bit more memory. Production level, the S1 is the first one that's going to give us staging slots. And you'll note that we can also do custom domains and SSLs on that. But also, if you were going to do more than just a medium-sized business public-facing website, you might use one of the premium tiers for an enterprise level, or you might even go to a higher tier as an isolated level. We're sticking with S1 for our purposes. Again, we're going to skip over the deployment, but if we were to do this here, we could actually change out GitHub and such. We could get that wired up. On the monitoring, we're going to go ahead and create a new one in the East US for Application Insights. We're not going to tag anything, so we're going to go ahead and review and create this, and then we will go ahead and create this. And there we see that it's completed, and we're going to go ahead and go to our resource. We have the overview. Over here we have deployment slots, deployment center. Those are going to be important later. Configuration is going to be important. Authentication and identity will be important. We have the app service plan. We have the link to the app service here. We can click on it. We see that we have a default website. So that is all it takes to provision a website at Azure, and we are ready for the next steps. So the next thing we're going to do is dive into creating the database that we'll use to back our website. So as we provision our Azure SQL Server, there's a couple things we need to worry about. First of all, we'll create this from the database level, and as we create the database, we will add the server to that deployment. The SQL Server will be built out then, and the pieces of the puzzle that are important are the connection strings that we'll use to connect to the SQL Server, as well as the server firewall. We need to make sure to allow Azure services and resources to access this server so that we can communicate between the web app and the SQL Server. Additionally, we'll add our client IP address just to make sure we can log in from Query Analyzer and look at that from the portal or from our own SQL Server Management Studio on our own desktop. And so what we're going to do now is go ahead and provision the Azure SQL Server in the portal with the SQL database. So we're just going to go ahead and do an Azure SQL. And when we do the Azure SQL, we will create this. Again, we will create the database as a single database. You could do Elastic Pool or Database Server standalone here. You can also do SQL Managed Instances or Virtual Machine with an image on it. We're not going to do that today. We're going to do a single database that comes with the server, essentially. We're going to go ahead and create that. And again, we'll put it into the correct resource group, and we'll make sure to name the database something that makes sense. The server will need to be created with a unique name here. So let's go ahead and do that quickly. When we create the server, we have the authentication method of using SQL authentication or using the Azure Active Directory or using a combination like a mixed mode of a SQL admin and Azure Active Directory. We're just going to do SQL authentication today. Once we do that, we'll create our server, and we will again need a name for this. So we'll just name our database A2Z Simple Web DB, and it's going to be on the Azure A2Z Simple Web DB server. We're going to not use an elastic pool. We need to change the size to be the basic, so to give us the least amount of workload, but also the lowest cost. If you were on a standard, you might do a standard. I think about $15 a month. Premium would be a little more expensive, obviously. We're going to go ahead and just do local redundant backup storage. Remember that as a platform solution, we get backups automatically. For networking, we need a public endpoint here so that we can connect to it. We need to allow Azure services. We need to allow the current IP address so we can connect to it, or leave the connection policy to default. For security, we would ordinarily want to turn on Microsoft Defender. We're going to go ahead and leave that off today. We're not going to configure a ledger identity or transparent data encryption. For the additional settings, we're going to go ahead and do blank with the default collation and the default maintenance window. No tags. So that will go ahead and review and create, and then we'll be able to deploy our Azure SQL database on our Azure SQL Server. And there we see that our deployment has completed. So here we can see on the SQL Server, we have the database. We have the ability to check the server firewall up here. So let's do that quickly. Make sure that we have the Azure services and a client IP allowed. And we do. Let's go ahead and go back. And on our SQL database here, just a couple of things. Most importantly, the connection strings, which you can get here or here. And so we'll need this connection string. And so we're going to go ahead and copy this right now and put it in a notepad. And then I'm going to update my password to make sure that it maps to what I want. And I'm going to take that off screen. Once I have that, I'm ready to go for the next step. So now the next thing we're going to do is modify the app service configuration. And so really when it comes to the app service configuration, there are just two things we really need to be concerned about at this point, and a few more coming later. But the main one is we need to make sure we have our connection string, which is going to have default connection, which is going to map to the name of the connection in our code. You'll see up here that we have the Application Insights instrumentation key, and that's going to map to the App Insights instance. And so this is a pretty straightforward demo, so we're going to go ahead and make sure that we have that set up. So we go back into our app service. We're going to go ahead and on the configuration section, we'll review that we do have an App Insights key here, and then ultimately we have a new connection string. We're going to name this default connection, and that value will come from what we got from the connection string earlier. We'll set this to Azure SQL, and we'll also want to make sure that this is a deployment slot setting so that it will stick to our production slot. Even though we're using the same database for both, we want to make sure that we don't accidentally swap out the connection string in case we weren't using the same database. And that's all there is to making sure that that's set up. Make sure to save. And we have our configuration set. So the next thing we want to look at is getting deployment out there. So this is going to require us to go out and get an application, get it wired up in GitHub, and then also have that so that we can deploy it to our Azure App Service. And so once again, as we deploy, remember there are multiple ways to do this. We could have done this right away from the start. We could have done this through the deployment center at any time, which is actually what we're going to do because we're going to create a slot, and then we're going to get that wired up through GitHub. You could also do this manually at GitHub, so you can always just create your own. Or any other provider. It doesn't have to be GitHub as long as there's an actions engine that you can use. ADO has one, GitLab has one, Bitbucket has one. So just use the appropriate actions that are appropriate for your solution. Typically, your deployment is going to be done with a YAML file. And so in this case, we'll get a two-stage file, a build stage and a deploy stage. And we could also modify that YAML to delete the artifact, which we'll do. Also, we're going to have secrets that are going to be generated. They're going to be stored in the GitHub repository. And so those secrets will map to the published profile. And we'll see that as we build it out here. So let's go ahead and get this started. So what I have right now is out at my own repo under BL Gorman DN6 Simple Web with auth. I have already created an application that has basically everything we need to do this demo very quickly. And it's a template. So you could go get this. It's a public template. You could click use this template and it'll bring it into your environment. So I'm going to call this A to Z Simple Web DN6. It's the Azure A to Z demo website. It's going to be private. I'm going to go ahead and just bring the main branch. That's the only one I care about. I'm going to go ahead and create the repository from the template. This will bring the code over into my own repository and will allow me to create actions on it so that I can do that against the Azure website. So there it is. Everything's here. And I'm going to go ahead and also get the link to clone this for later as well. And I'll put that in my notepad so I can have it handy. So now that I have a website to deploy to, the next step is to go back to my app service and create a deployment slot. We're going to do this through the deployment slot for a staging slot. So let's go ahead and add a slot named staging. And we'll go ahead and clone the settings because we're going to just re-leverage everything. We can change the App Insights instrumentation key as well as the database connection string later if we want to. And our slot is created. So let's go ahead and drill into the slot. Now this is actually going to be its own separate instance. So let's go ahead and open that in a new tab. And in that new tab, then let's go to the deployment slot. And that deployment slot now is our staging slot. So here we are, and it has its own website as well, also not deployed currently. Let's go to the deployment center and wire up our GitHub account. So we're going to go ahead and choose from GitHub, but you see Bitbucket, Local Git, Azure Repos. You can even do a manual deployment where you sync things. You have a public-facing website you just want to deploy. You can go ahead and do that, and then you just hit the sync button to deploy it if changes are happening at the repo. In this case, we'll build an action so it will automatically deploy. So we'll get this full CI/CD. So again, we're selecting the A to Z Simple Web DN6 that we just created from the template and the main branch, and it's going to be .NET version 6, which is what we want. Let's go ahead and save that. What will happen as this saves is it will actually build the deployment. So it's going to build that and it's going to deploy it because it's going to make it so that the YAML file will actually deploy on push to main. It'll also add this workflow dispatch, which allows us to do a manual trigger at any point, going to the actions and just pushing run on any branch. Additionally, you see that it's going to go ahead and use Windows as an agent here in the build step. It's going to go ahead and build that out and deploy it here in a deploy step where it deploys it to the web app. So here we see the app name is hard-coded here. Also, what's important is the secrets. So the secrets here get this little unique identifier on the end, C31, DA6, etc. And so ultimately, that setting is stored in the secrets for our repo right here. Now you can't modify this by looking at it. So you can either update it or remove it. So if you suspect your published profile isn't correct, just reset it. Don't try to find out what it is. You'll never be able to very easily, if at all. And all it is really is go out to the staging, go to the overview, grab this published profile, download it, take the value of the XML from in there, and go to your secret here in the repo and update this or put a new one in, and drop the value in here with the name. And so that's all they're doing there. So all we need is the published profile secret, and then ultimately we have our actions. Here again, it's running, but you see if I click on that action specifically, here I can run the workflow on any branch because of the workflow dispatch that's included in the YAML file. While this is continuing to build, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this repo locally. So I'm going to just use Visual Studio Code, and I'm just going to do git clone with that link that I got earlier for my repo. We see that with the code here, I do get a couple of things. I do have a deploy YAML here to update the YAML at the very end with delete archive to keep GitHub clean. So we can go ahead and do that. There's also an environment variable for the web app that we could do if you wanted to do that as well. And then you would have to reset your published profile if you use this. So here's my main right now. I'm just going to go ahead and drop this here, so that we have that delete archive to delete the .NET app to keep GitHub cleaner. So we're going to go ahead and git add dot. Oops, I need to get into the directory, push that back out, and that's actually going to trigger a build at Azure as well. So it will rebuild. While that's happening and getting deployed, we know that what's going to happen is ultimately the staging was deployed here, and we had that deployed through the first build that completed. You see that it's here, but if I were to try to log in or register at this point, you'll see that the application is not wired up to the database, even though we have the connection string set, because the migrations aren't run. So we need to do that. So the easiest way to do that quickly is to just open up the web app that we just downloaded and modify the connection string and run migrations from our local desktop, which is again why the IP needs to be set correctly. So here I have gone ahead and done that. My package manager console here, I'm just going to go ahead and run an update database to run those initial migrations. Obviously, you'll want a real strategy for your deployments in the public web for your enterprise level applications, but this will get everything working so that our application will have the database backing it at Azure. And of course, again, it is dependent on the connection string here being mapped to my database, as well as my client IP being added to the server firewall. Once we're done with that, I don't need that anymore. I'll change back to using local. I'm also going to go ahead and make my user secrets file that I'll need later. And then in the repo, when we downloaded it, there was a sample user secrets file. So I want to grab this, and I'm going to drop that into my secrets. And then ultimately, I need an app insights connection string, and I'll put that here, and then eventually an app configuration connection. I'll be doing that off camera, but you'll understand what I mean when we get there to those things. Ultimately, at this point, I just need to wire this up to a developer instance of App Insights. And if I go out to Azure and I look at my current resource group, what I can see is that I have an Opsgility A to Z Developer Insights here. So what I can do is get my connection string for that, and I can drop that into my developer secrets in these two places, here and here. And that should allow me to run this application locally, and it will then also be able to wire up and connect directly to the Azure Application Insights. So there's my site running locally. There's my live metrics being loaded at Azure for my developer insights. There they are. So over here on the right-hand side, you see the sample telemetry. If I hit this demo live app website insights, we'll see that it's writing to that. On the home page as well, we have a couple of things being traced. Right now, they're not set, and that's okay. That's what we expected. So it is wired up to my developer insights, which is awesome. Everything's working locally, and I would be able to update my database locally and register and log in as well. But the most important part is that making sure that we get everything that we have out to Azure, and also once it's out to Azure, that we can do things at our site. So hopefully by now the build has completed. Again, if we look at the actions, we can see where things have completed. There's the cleanup archive, and this one did deploy. It did delete the artifact we expected, so we're good. And then ultimately, if I wanted to, on that deployment, I can click the link and go directly to it, and we see it's right here. Now if I try to log in or register an account, let's register Bob and Bob's password. As long as our database connection string is set correctly on the app configuration, it is. We are good. Additionally, we can go ahead and confirm the email so we can log in as Bob. Let's go ahead and log in as Bob. So we have right now the app deployed to staging. We have the deployment done through GitHub Actions. Those are all cleaned up the way we want them. And we're logged in as a user, so that proves that our database is wired up correctly here on the configuration. Additionally, the application insights is going to use the same one as production for this case, but if I wanted to, I could change that key or that connection string. If I go out here, I should be able to see the live application insights for my staging slot as well. And once that's up, I could click on the links here as well and see I'm getting logged. So there it is. Let's go ahead and hit it a couple times. And you see that they're getting logged just like we would expect. So we're good. Everything deployed, everything's good. We're all good to go. All right, for the next thing, then we're going to go ahead and move to the Azure App Config. So in this case, maybe you want to have some settings that are shared amongst your applications, not just specific to a single application. And ultimately, you want to reuse that and not have to add it to every single app service, especially in an app server farm, right? So what you're going to need is some sort of common configuration, and that's what the Azure App Configuration is for. It allows us to add values and secrets and actually integrate with Key Vault very easily, which we'll see at the end. So we need to configure this correctly at our Azure portal, where we're going to set up the app configuration and make sure that we have connection between our web app, our staging slot, and the app config. And that requires making sure that we have identities in place for a managed identity on the app service and slot so they can connect and be added to the role for the Azure App Config data reader. And we'll see that being built out in just a minute. Ultimately, that will look something like this. We'll be adding in a user that we find, the staging slot or the regular web app, and we'll be adding those into the role assignments for the Azure App Configuration data reader on our Azure App Config. So let's go ahead and create an app config and get that wired up. So here we're going to create an Azure App Configuration, and we'll go ahead and create a new one. And this will be in our default resource group with the name of the, how about simple A to Z app config. And we'll go ahead and do it in the East US with, we can do with a free tier for this, it doesn't matter. Networking, we're going to go ahead and do automatic. Tags we'll leave alone. We'll go ahead and review and create that and get it out there. And so while we're waiting for that to deploy, what we can do is we can go out to each of the app services, the app service prod and the slot, and make sure that we have identity set. So here on the app service, go to the identity, select on and save for system assigned identity here. And then also we'll do the same thing on the slot. So if we go back to the slot, go to the identity and turn that on as well. So that way we can have the identity for each of the slots so that we can give them roles in our Azure Role-Based Access Control in our Azure Active Directory and be able to authenticate in the app configuration. So the app config is deployed. So here, what we want to do is very simple. We want to go to the authorization access control here. And on this, we want to add 2 new role assignments. And we want the app configuration data reader role. And we want to go ahead and add the 2 things that we just did. So let's go ahead and do A-2-Z. And there they are. So let's go ahead and do the regular production slot. We'll go ahead and review and assign that. And then we'll add 1 more role assignment. This is going to be the Azure App Config Data Reader role for the staging slot. So A-2-Z. And this is the staging slot we're adding this time. So we'll go ahead and save that, review and assign. Now we'll have that as well. So both of those are in there. And then we'll go ahead and make sure that that's saved. So if we come back into there, we should see those roles are still there. There they are. We're good to go. So the next thing then, we need to actually add some application configuration values. So the first thing we'll do is create a key value for the app config. And this is going to map exactly to the settings that we have in our home controller right now. So here we're looking for simple web shared my simple value. And so I'm going to go ahead and put that there. And so I'm going to say this is a simple value from the application shared config. And I don't need a label. The content type is a string. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. Now that gives us the application value. But in order for us to read this, I need this endpoint. This is the endpoint simple A to Z app config AZ config IO, whatever that maps to my current app configuration. Let's go to the staging slot itself and go to the configuration there. And we'll add this in. And this is because I don't have anything in production yet. Otherwise, I could put it there as well. The value is going to be just that web endpoint. Since we're going to authenticate, this will work. And then ultimately, the name of this has to map to what we're looking for in our code as well. What we're looking for in our code is actually going to be this, Azure App Config Connection. And while I'm here, I may as well turn this on so that I can get that deployed, which requires me to add in the libraries for Azure Identity and Microsoft Extensions configuration. So actually, let's come back to that in a second. Let's go ahead and put this out there so that I don't lose my place. And this is going to be a sticky setting as well. We'll need it in both, actually. So if we take that and save it and go back to our production slot as well, go to the configuration there, and we'll go ahead and do the setting there the same way. This is going to be the same URL that I need here. So let's go ahead and put that in. Okay, we'll save that. So that will ultimately reset the app services. While that's happening, let's go ahead and go back to our web app. So I need to add the Azure App Configuration. So I need to get the library Microsoft Extensions Configuration, Azure App Configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Tools, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. And then I'm going to go ahead and browse for that. And there it is. We'll go ahead and add that in and install that. Okay, and then it looks like we have an error from my code here. Yep, we'll always need that credential. And so I need Azure Identity. So I can just do that, find and install latest version. So that's going to bring in Azure Identity. So now I have a managed identity credential working here. And then ultimately down here, when we do Key Vault, we'll turn that back on. For now, let's be done there. Let's go ahead and deploy this out. So we added in handling for the Azure App Config. We'll go ahead and commit that and save it and go ahead and deploy that out to our staging environment. One other thing that I wanted to show you was that this is wired up to just use my local Azure App Config, and I'm going to do this through the connection string and my user secrets. So I need to get my full connection string for my Azure App Config and place that here in order for it to work. So that's under the access keys, and then under the access keys, I'll just grab the connection string here, and I'll grab that and put it into my local user secrets, which doesn't, of course, require any kind of deployment because this is all local. But that way, if I run it locally now, I should be able to connect to the Azure App Config as long as my user that I'm logged in as has rights. And you would see that they do have a simple value from the application shared config is set. So the last thing then would be the key vault for the local. And then ultimately, this should be done deploying. So if we go back here, let's double check and make sure that our deployment is completed. Actually, it's still running, so we'll wait just another minute. All right, the deployment completed. So now if we go out and look at our site from the Azure App Config, we can see that it's reading in just fine. This is a simple value from the application shared config being read in just like we would expect it to on our staging site. And that brings us to the final piece, which is getting things wired up with Key Vault. And so getting the Key Vault to work is not going to be very difficult. Essentially, we just need to create a Key Vault and add a secret to it called Simple Web Secret or whatever we want it to be called, and then put some value in there to differentiate it. And then we need to make sure to add the access policies for both of our slots and the app config, because adding the app config alone is not going to give it enough rights. If we just add the app config, we'll still get an error. We need to have every reader that's reading the Key Vault be able to have at least the get secret permission. And so we're going to do that. You'll also then need to make sure your developers have access to use it locally, and you'll need to make those final code changes in order for the code to work. So we're going to go ahead and demo that as we complete the corner here towards home to get our Key Vault integration working on our site. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create a Key Vault, and there we'll just create a new one, and we'll put it in our resource group and give it the name that makes sense for the Simple Web Key Vault. Now this will need to be unique, so if someone's already used that, we'll have a problem. So we need to give it something more unique to that. So let's do A to Z Simple Web Key Vault. And the pricing tier is standard on this one. And we'll go ahead and leave soft delete on and retain it for 90 days. You can mess around with that on your own. The access policies here, we can actually add our access policies. We'll do that post-mortem after we get it deployed. But ultimately, you could do it here. Also, you can give extra access for virtual machines, resource manager, and disk encryption. You see that my default user needs to have kind of the owner God mode rights. There's a few more that this one doesn't even have. Ultimately, I could add them in at any point since I'm the owner of the subscription. So we'll just leave the default settings there as well and go ahead and deploy this. So there's our Key Vault. Let's go ahead and create a secret. The secret name can be whatever we want here. It doesn't have to map to anything in our code, but it will have to be mapped to from our app config. So we'll do that in a minute. But ultimately, we'll do a manual secret here. The name is just going to be A to Z Simple Secret. It could be anything we want here. So put whatever you want. And the value, this is, see this I don't like. I can't see what I'm typing. Okay, so you'll never see this value. I'm just going to drop it in here. Oops, you'll see it there. And so you won't ever see this value. It's a secret. And so I'll just go ahead and say that this is a string. You can set activation dates. You can also make it a disabled or add some tags to it if you'd like. I don't need any of that. So there's my A to Z simple secret, and that's going to be leveraged. And again, I need access policies here. So I need to add access policies for secret management. And ultimately, I only need get. So I'm going to deselect everything and just turn on get only. And for that, I will go ahead and add in the app config first of all. So simple A to Z app config. Oh, look, I didn't give it an identity yet. All right, so before I can add the app config to Key Vault as an access policy, I need to go ahead and give it an identity. So we'll do a system-assigned identity for that and save that so that the simple A to Z app config can be found and authorized to do things. So then we'll go back into our Key Vault, and underneath the access policies, we're going to add a new access policy here, configured from secret management. We only need the get permission. We don't need anything else. And the principal is going to be our app config. We'll go ahead and select that, add that, and save it. So you have to do these individually, and you have to save it each time or you lose them. So make sure you do that. And once it's done, you can create the next one. So here again, we're going to just do secret management. Again, we'll deselect everything and hit the get method there. And then ultimately, this is going to be A to Z, A-2-Z. We'll do the production web app first. It doesn't matter the order, of course. I'm just doing that first because it was on the top. And this time I need to make sure that when I do the A to Z, I get the slot. So once again, one last time, we'll do a secret management. We'll delete all of them but get, and we'll use the principal for A to Z staging. So we've added in 3 different access policies for get for our basically every slot and every app service we need to have access to it needs get, as well as the app config needs get, or it won't be able to read from it. And so there we have our access policies set up. Everybody has identities. We should be good on that. The last thing is to make sure we actually add the key. So back in the simple app config, going to the Configuration Explorer, let's create a key vault reference. And this key is going to map to the code simple web shared my secret value. So even though they're coming from different places, that doesn't matter. We can just leverage it that way. So the label doesn't matter here. And ultimately, what I want to do is go ahead and use the subscription group and key vault that I want to connect to. And then I'll select the secret and the version. And I'll just use the latest version. But if you need a specific version, you can do that as long as the version is active. So there we go. So we have simple web shared my secret value, simple web shared my simple value. The last thing then to make this work is I need to authenticate. If I tried to read this now, let's just show the error. If I tried to read this locally, we would get an authentication error. And if I deploy it, I'd get a 503. So if you ever see that, that's probably what's going on. But you see, I can't do this because it says no key vault credential or secret resolver callback configured. No matching secret client could be found. Ultimately, it needs a credential in order to prove that it can read from key vault, even though I'm going through the app config. So that's why we have to have this extra line of code here. So we'll add to the managed identity credential that we're deploying, we'll add a chain of the .config vault value. So after we .connect, we'll .config vault, and we'll just do the same credential that we had, which is the managed identity for the web app. And then ultimately, locally, we'll just use a default Azure credential for me. And that we'll go ahead and set that. And we need these 2 deleted so that we map correctly. So now if I run locally, just to prove this would work, this should be able to read through the app config to key vault with my credential as Boba Fett, hopefully being able to read from the key vault here. So hopefully we won't get the error this time. All right, so let's go ahead and push it up and get it out there for the test instance so that at least the test instance will work. And with the managed identity for the app, that should not be an issue. So we'll just say added the key vault access in the code. Go ahead and push that out so that the deployment will happen. And then while that's happening, let's just make sure it works locally. All right, and there you can see that the code works as expected. We're able to get the secret from Key Vault and be able to read that out as we would have expected to. And once this is completed, we'll just validate that it works in our staging environment. All right, the deployment has completed. Let's check it out in staging. And there it is. And we're reading from Key Vault and we're reading from the application. So everything is wired up exactly like we would expect it to be. So the last thing we need to do is just really quickly get this deployed into production. So we'll go back out to our production slot here underneath deployment slots and we'll swap it out. And we'll go ahead and swap that into production and make sure the production is wired up correctly. And all right, the swap has completed. So let's go ahead and take a look at the main slot here. And let's go ahead and hit it. And there we go. The value is being read from Key Vault. And in fact, this is the first time we're on production, but because we have everything wired up, we should be able to log in as Bob just fine and see everything just like we would expect. So we have everything wired up and working the way we wanted it to. Ultimately then, today we covered the traditional web architecture and moved into provisioning an app service with Azure SQL. We then moved to the app service config where we showed the connection string for the database as well as the application insights connection string and key. We then automated the deployment with CI/CD and modified that a little bit. We set the Azure app config to use a shared configuration for different app services if we needed to, and ultimately then integrated Key Vault secrets into that app config on our application. That's going to wrap up this session. Once again, thank you for attending the Azure A to Z Web Apps presentation done by me, Brian Gorman, for Skill Me Up Academy Appsagility. Thank you very much, and have a great day.